She hasn't held a job since college and now she's picking the bones of her own dead mother. That's what my father said, under oath, to a jury of 11 people who'd known him since before I could walk. I didn't flinch. I didn't turn. I lifted the plastic cup of water in front of me, took a slow sip. It tasted like iron and old pipes, the kind of water that's been sitting in courthouse walls since 1971. I set the cup back down without a sound. My name is Maura Sutton. I'm 43 years old. And up until 9 seconds ago I was sitting in the witness box of Harlan County Circuit Court, listening to my father describe a woman I barely recognized. Now I'm watching him wave a manila folder at the jury like it's a battle flag. His face the color of brick dust. His voice filling every corner of a room that smells like old oak and someone else's guilt. He doesn't know what's inside the sealed envelope sitting in my attorney's briefcase. Not yet. But he will. I learned early that in the Sutton family silence was never read as discipline. It was read as confession. The quieter I went, the louder my father spoke for me, filling the space I left with whatever story suited the moment best. And the story he landed on was simple. Maura left. Maura failed. Maura is hiding something. Denial, I came to understand, was their native language. Growing up on a dairy farm outside Millhaven, Vermont, I was the difficult child. Too analytical, too watchful, too precise. My sister Claire was 5 years younger and twice as simple to love. She laughed at my father's jokes before the punchline landed. She fed the cows without being asked. She married local, taught 3rd grade at the elementary school 2 miles from the house where we were both born. Claire fit the frame. I was the piece from a different puzzle hammered in with a thumbnail and a prayer. My father, Edmund Sutton, was a retired dairy farmer and a former town selectman. 2 titles he wore like military decorations on a general's chest. In Harlan County those titles meant something. They meant you could walk into the hardware store and leave without paying until Friday. They meant the pastor asked your opinion before changing the hymn rotation. And they meant that when Edmund Sutton said something about his eldest daughter in a room full of people who trusted him, every word landed like gospel. When I left for the army at 22, the morning air smelled like frost and manure and something I couldn't name then but can name now, finality. No farewell dinner, no group photograph. Just a duffel bag on the porch and a ride to the bus station in a truck that needed new shocks. My father's last words to me that morning were flat and practical. Don't come back broke. I didn't come back broke. I didn't come back at all. Not for a long time. What they didn't know, what I never explained, was that 6 years into my service, after 2 tactical assignments in signals intelligence, I was approached by the Defense Intelligence Agency. The work I'd been doing, theater-level intercepts, electronic warfare analysis, had drawn interest from people whose names I am still not cleared to say in public. By 2009 I had a new title, a new cover identity, and a life that existed almost entirely behind doors requiring 2 forms of identification and a retinal scan. My cover was Senior Administrative Analyst for an organization called Meridian Strategic Partners. A glorified paper pusher. A DC address and a government salary that looked, on paper, like exactly the kind of safe, ordinary work my father had always despised. I work in analysis, I told Claire when she asked. Same contracts, different problems. That's what I told my mother before the cancer took her voice, and then the rest of her in the winter of 2021. My mother's death rewrote the mathematics of the Sutton family in ways I hadn't anticipated. She'd established a trust, modest by most standards, significant by Harlan County math, with terms requiring beneficiaries to demonstrate active employment before receiving disbursements. It was a safeguard she'd constructed deliberately because she knew her husband. She knew his ideas about work. She knew he'd find a way to punish the daughter who left if given even the thinnest procedural edge. He was right. Within 3 months of the funeral, Edmund filed a challenge. He hired a private investigator, a man named Frank Morse from Keene, who charged $40 an hour and clearly earned every cent by confirming what any civilian search engine would show. Meridian Strategic Partners had no physical headquarters visible on any public map. Maura Sutton had no LinkedIn profile, no social media presence, no corporate headshot on any company website, no evidence, in Frank Morse's professional opinion, that Maura Sutton had held any form of gainful employment in the preceding 15 years. My father took that report and built a cathedral out of it. He told Claire I was a professional freeloader operating off a fabricated DC address. He told the neighbors I'd been drawing on my mother's trust while pretending to be important. He told the selectmen's wives over coffee at the diner on Route 9 that his eldest daughter was a parasite hiding in the capital. A woman too proud to come home and milk cows, but not too proud to steal from her own dead mother. They hadn't just forgotten me. They had erased me. Family photographs lined the fireplace mantel in the farmhouse living room. I saw them the one time I returned for the reading of the will. Every single one of them featured Claire. Claire's wedding, Claire's classroom, Claire at the county fair holding a ribbon for her strawberry preserves. Not one photograph of me. Not even the commissioning portrait my mother had once framed and hung in the hallway. That one had been replaced with a feed store calendar. The suit was filed in Harlan County Circuit Court on a Tuesday in March. Trust fraud. That was the claim. Edmund's attorney, a man named Richard Vance, who had handled Edmund's property disputes for 2 decades and had never once argued a case involving federal employment verification, stood before the bench and laid out his position with the polished confidence of a man who had never seriously considered the possibility that he might be wrong. Your Honor, the plaintiff contends that the defendant, Maura Sutton, has failed to meet the active employment clause of the Eleanor R. Sutton Family Trust. The defendant claims employment with an entity known as Meridian Strategic Partners. Our investigation reveals this entity has no verifiable public presence, no office, no website, no registered employees. The defendant has produced no pay stubs, no W-2 forms available through standard channels, and no professional references. We believe the defendant has fabricated this employment in order to fraudulently access trust disbursements totaling approximately $68,000 over 3 years. Edmund sat in the front row behind his attorney's table. He wore his good blazer, the one he saved for town meetings and funerals. Arms crossed. Jaw set in that granite line I recognized from every argument I'd ever lost at the dinner table. He looked at me once during Richard's opening. Just once. And in that look was everything he'd ever decided about me. That I was soft, that I was dishonest, that I was a woman who hadn't worked a day since college. He had built his case carefully, brick by brick. Claire sat 3 rows behind him. Blue cardigan. Hands folded in her lap. She didn't look at me, not because she was angry but because she was ashamed. 15 years of Edmund's narrative had settled into her bones like cold that never fully leaves a house. She believed it. Not entirely, Claire was sharper than that, but enough. Enough to sit on his side of the courtroom. Enough not to call me when the suit was filed. Enough to let the silence between us calcify into something that felt permanent. The courtroom was small, suffocating. Wood-paneled walls the color of weak tea. A jury box holding 11 chairs with cracked leather seats. A ceiling fan that turned so slowly it seemed decorative. The air pressed down with the smell of floor wax and paper and Edmund's cologne, the same drugstore brand he'd worn since I was 11, applied too heavily as if volume were a substitute for character. I sat beside my attorney James Holt. James was 46, former JAG, with the particular stillness of a man who had argued before military tribunals in 3 different countries. He knew the full truth, every word of it. But he was bound by the same non-disclosure agreement that had shaped my life for 15 years. Until the proper authorization arrived, he could do nothing but object on procedural grounds and wait. I folded my hands on the wooden rail of the witness box. Posture vertical. Expression neutral. The small matte gray pin on my lapel caught the overhead fluorescent light for a half-second, then went flat again. Richard Vance approached with the private investigator's report. He held it up for the jury. He read passages aloud. He lingered on the phrase, "no verifiable public presence," the way a revival preacher lingers on scripture. Then he turned to me. "Miss Sutton, can you explain to this court why your alleged employer has no physical office, no website and no record of your employment in any public database?" I looked past him at my father. "I work in analysis. Some clients require discretion." Richard blinked. The jury shifted. Edmund uncrossed his arms and leaned forward. "Miss Sutton," he reset slower this time the theatrical pivot, "can you provide this court with a single verifiable piece of evidence that you have been employed at any point in the last 15 years? James placed his hand flat on the table. "A signal." "Not yet." I held my gaze on Richard Vance. My voice didn't shake. "The records are accurate. Your perception of them is not." Then Edmund stood. His chair scraped against the hardwood, a sound like a blade drawn across glass. Even the ceiling fan seemed to hesitate. She's lying. His voice didn't need to rise. Edmund Sutton was a man who had run town meetings for 30 years. He projected with the certainty of someone who has never been corrected in a room full of people who depended on his approval. She has been lying for 15 years. She abandoned this family. She let her mother die without visiting more than twice. She pushed paper in some fabricated office while the rest of us kept this farm from drowning. And now she wants to collect money she didn't earn from a woman she barely knew anymore. He pointed at me. Thick calloused finger. Steady. A woman who hasn't worked a day since college. A parasite hiding in D.C. And I intend to prove it. Richard stepped forward with the manila folder. He opened it on the rail before the jury. Photographs. Printouts. An empty Google Maps screenshot of the address I'd listed. Database searches returning 0 results. He laid them out like playing cards in what he believed was a winning hand. Your Honor, we move to enter Exhibit 7. The results of a comprehensive background investigation confirming that no individual named Mara Sutton has held a registered position with any entity matching the description of Meridian Strategic Partners. Judge Samuel Pratt looked down from the bench. He was in his early 60s, silver-haired, wire-rimmed glasses, the face of a man who had absorbed 10,000 lies and developed a separate silence for each variety. He accepted the exhibit without comment. Then his gaze found me. And it stopped. It held. Something shifted in his expression, something so minute that no one else in that room would have caught it. A tightening at the corner of his jaw. A stillness behind those lenses that went somewhere deeper than judicial composure. He caught the pin. I turned away before he could ask. Not because I was threatened. Because I understood exactly how fragile the next few minutes were going to be. James leaned toward me. His voice was barely a breath. The authorization is confirmed. Major Cole is in the building. I took another sip of the metallic water. I set the cup down. I said nothing. Tomorrow they'll call me something else entirely. Edmund settled back into his chair. Richard snapped his folder shut with a satisfied click. The jury watched me with the polite suspicion of people who had already arranged their verdict. Claire pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders and stared at the floor. The room was still. The ceiling fan turned. And somewhere beyond the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom, a pair of boots struck marble. Measured, deliberate. Getting closer. They hadn't counted on one thing. The boots stopped outside the doors. I didn't turn. I didn't need to. Richard Vance was still positioned near the jury box, his fingertips resting on the investigator's report like a man protecting his winnings. He was already composing his next question. I could see it forming behind his eyes. The theatrical pivot. The slow approach to the witness box designed to make a woman feel exposed in front of people who were already prepared to disbelieve her. He never got to ask it. James Wright stood. The motion was unhurried and exact, the economy of a man trained in rooms where wasted movement signals weakness. Your Honor, the defense would like to submit a document into evidence. Richard turned. Objection. Discovery has closed. Any new evidence should have been presented during pretrial. This document was not available during pretrial discovery, James said. His voice was flat as a compass reading. It required authorization from the Office of General Counsel of the Defense Intelligence Agency. That authorization was granted 48 hours ago. The document has been delivered to this courthouse under escort and is available for the court's review under the provisions of Title 10, Section 144. Governing the verification of classified service records. Richard blinked. He looked at Judge Pratt. Judge Pratt looked at James. Counselor. The judge's voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles a room faster than a gavel. What is the nature of this document? It is a sealed Pentagon verification letter, Your Honor. Form 10 Alpha Special Clearance. It confirms the defendant's continuous active service, rank and employment status for the entire period in question. It has been pre-authorized for limited judicial review within the context of this civil proceeding. The room shifted, not visibly, not with any sound, but I felt it. The way pressure drops before a storm rolls through a valley. Jurors exchanged glances. Richard's mouth opened and closed. Edmund leaned forward in his chair, his hands white-knuckling his knees. Your Honor, this is absurd. The defense is attempting to introduce some kind of, Mr. Vance. Judge Pratt's voice was 2 degrees cooler. I will review the document. Approach, Mr. Holt. James lifted his briefcase onto the table, opened it with both hands. Beneath a yellow legal pad and 2 manila folders sat a white envelope. Not large. Not theatrical. Roughly the size of a utility bill. But the seal embossed on its face was unmistakable to anyone who had served. The eagle and shield of the Department of Defense, blue and gold, with a classification stripe running along the left edge. He carried it to the bench the way you carry something that can rewrite everything in a room. Judge Pratt accepted the envelope. He held it a moment without opening it. His eyes moved from the seal to the classification stripe to the return address in the upper corner. Then slowly, very slowly, his gaze moved back across the courtroom. Past Richard. Past Edmund. Past all 11 jurors in their cracked leather seats. To me. To the pin. Most people in that courtroom had dismissed it on first glance. Richard had probably assumed it was decorative, a brooch picked up at a department store by a woman trying to look important. Edmund hadn't noticed it at all. Claire might have seen it, but Claire wouldn't have known what it meant. Judge Samuel Pratt knew exactly what it meant. He knew because he had spent 22 years as a colonel in the United States Marine Corps Judge Advocate General's Corps before taking the bench in Harlan County. He had reviewed classified service records in chambers at Camp Lejeune and Quantico. He had adjudicated cases involving non-disclosed personnel whose careers existed entirely behind redaction marks and SCI compartments. He had seen that pin before. Not often. Never in a county courtroom in Vermont. But enough times to know with complete certainty that it was not sold in stores, not awarded for participation, and not worn by people who pushed paper for a living. His jaw tightened, the same micro-expression I had caught minutes earlier, now deeper, more certain. He opened the envelope. I watched his eyes move across the page. Left to right. Top to bottom. Then back to the top. Then he stopped reading and sat perfectly still for 4 full seconds. I counted them. 1, 2, 3, 4. The courtroom was silent. The ceiling fan turned. Somewhere beyond the double doors, those boots had gone completely still. Judge Pratt removed his glasses. Set them on the bench. Pressed both palms flat against the wooden surface. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that had nothing to do with the acoustics of the room. Mr. Holt, has your client authorized disclosure of this document's contents in open court? She has, Your Honor, within the parameters outlined on page 2. And those parameters permit confirmation of rank and active service status? Yes, Your Honor. Judge Pratt replaced his glasses. He looked at me, not at the witness, not at the defendant. At me. And in that look, I recognized something I had not encountered in a civilian courtroom in 2 decades of service. Recognition. Bailiff, he said. Please secure the courtroom doors. The heavy oak doors closed behind the gallery with a sound like a vault ceiling shut. Richard shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Edmund's hands were still locked around his knees. Claire looked up from the floor for the first time since the hearing began. Before I address the contents of this document, Judge Pratt said, I want to note for the record that I am familiar with the verification protocol referenced in the accompanying cover letter. I am further noting for the record my professional recognition of the Intelligence Service designation insignia currently worn by the defendant. Richard turned to look at me. His eyes dropped to the pin. He frowned. He didn't understand it. Edmund didn't move. The document before me, Judge Pratt continued, is a Form 10 Alpha Special Clearance Verification issued by the Office of General Counsel, Defense Intelligence Agency, Washington, D.C. It confirms the following. He paused. 2 full seconds. In that silence, the fluorescent light above buzzed like something trapped and trying to get out. The defendant, Mara Sutton, holds the rank of Brigadier General in the United States Army. She has served on continuous active duty for 21 years, including 15 years in classified operational roles under the authority of the Defense Intelligence Agency. Her service record is maintained under top-secret sensitive compartmented information protocols, and her cover designation, Meridian Strategic Partners, was established and maintained by the Department of Defense as a matter of national operational security. Richard's folder slipped from his fingers. It struck the floor with a flat, papery sound. He did not pick it up. The jury foreman, a hardware store owner named Ray Donovan, a man I recognized from childhood, pressed his back against his chair as if the wood behind him were the last solid thing in the world. Claire's hand rose slowly to cover her mouth. And Edmund didn't move. Didn't breathe. The color left his face in stages. First the cheeks. Then the forehead. Then the skin around his mouth, until he looked like a man who had been carved from the same limestone as the courthouse steps. Judge Pratt straightened. His posture changed, subtly, but I saw it. The way his shoulders squared. The way his chin rose a quarter inch. The way his hands moved from the bench to the arms of his chair with a precision that had nothing to do with jurisprudence and everything to do with 22 years of Marine Corps protocol. His voice, when it came, carried a cadence I recognized immediately. Not the cadence of a county judge. The cadence of a colonel. The court recognizes the presence of Brigadier General Mara Sutton, United States Army. He paused. All rise. The bailiff stood first. Then the court reporter. Then the jurors, one by one. Ray Donovan last, his hand still gripping the arm of his chair. James Holt was already standing. Richard Vance rose on unsteady legs, his face the color of old chalk. Claire stood with both hands covering her mouth, her cardigan bunched at the elbows. Then the courtroom doors opened. Major Ethan Cole entered. 34 years old. Day liaison. Class A uniform pressed to a standard that made the fluorescent light catch every crease. His shoes struck the hardwood in a measured rhythm. Buff. Right. Buff. Right. Each step calibrated to fill the room the way Edmund's voice had filled it minutes before. Except this required no volume. It had something that volume can never manufacture. 40. He walked past the gallery. Past Claire. Past Edmund. Past Richard and his scattered folder on the floor. He stopped at the wooden rail of the witness box. He didn't look at my father. Not yet. He looked at me. And then Major Ethan Cole, Day Liaison United States Army, raised his hand in a salute. Crisp, formal, held. Not toward the judge. Not toward the jury. Toward me. The salute held for 3 seconds. I returned it. The motion was automatic. Muscle memory refined across 2 decades, in briefing rooms and SIFs and forward operating posts that appear on no map my father has ever owned. Major Cole lowered his hand. General Sutton. Ma'am, I'm here on behalf of the Office of General Counsel. The verification is confirmed. I nodded once. He stepped to the side, assumed parade rest, hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed forward. He became a wall of pressed fabric and polished brass. And the room reorganized itself around him without a single additional word. 9 jurors. 1 bailiff. 1 court reporter. 1 attorney. 1 sister. 1 retired dairy farmer from Harlan County, Vermont. All of them went very, very quiet. Edmund was still in his chair. He hadn't risen when the judge called the room to stand. His hands had released his knees and now hung at his sides, limp, the thick calloused fingers curling inward as if searching for something solid to hold on to. His jaw, that granite jaw I had known my entire life, the jaw that had never once loosened in an argument, never softened for an apology, had gone slack. He looked at me. For the first time in the hearing. For the first time in years he actually looked at me. General. His voice cracked on the word. It was barely a sound. You were just an analyst. You were just in DC. I held his gaze. My hands stayed folded. My posture stayed vertical. I said nothing. Because some wars aren't fought with fists. They're won in what happens next. The thing about silence is that it's not always passive. Sometimes silence is the sharpest answer in the room. Judge Pratt let the stillness hold for exactly as long as it needed to. Then he set the verification letter flat on the bench, aligned its edges with the wood grain the way a man handles a document he has been trained to respect, and addressed the room. Mr. Vance, in light of the evidence now before this court, I'm going to ask you a direct question. Does the plaintiff wish to continue this proceeding? Richard Vance was standing beside the jury box with nothing in his hands. His folder was still on the floor. His legal pad was back at the table. He looked like a man who had walked into a room expecting a handshake and found a firing line instead. Your Honor, he turned to Edmund. Edmund was still in his chair, still slack. Richard looked back at the bench. Your Honor, may I request a brief recess to confer with my client? Oh. Judge Pratt's voice was flat. Not punitive. Not theatrical. Flat the way a blade is flat before it cuts. The court has reviewed a verified Department of Defense document confirming 21 years of continuous active duty service. The plaintiff's entire claim rests on the assertion that the defendant was not employed during the period in question. That assertion is now contradicted by the highest verification authority available to a civilian court. I am not granting a recess. I am granting you 30 seconds to withdraw the complaint. Richard opened his mouth, then closed it. He walked to Edmund. Bent down. Whispered something. Edmund didn't respond. Richard whispered again. This time Edmund's lips moved. Barely, a single syllable I couldn't catch from the witness box. Richard straightened like a man pulling himself out of shallow water. Your Honor, the plaintiff withdraws the complaint. The complaint is dismissed with prejudice. Judge Pratt wrote something on the pad in front of him. Furthermore, this court is issuing sanctions against the plaintiff in the amount of $22,600 to cover the defendant's legal fees and the administrative costs incurred by the Department of Defense in generating the verification documents required by this proceeding. He paused. Set down his pen. Mr. Sutton, you filed suit against your own daughter on the basis of an investigation that couldn't locate her because she was not permitted to be found. You wasted this court's time. You consumed government resources. And you did so with the certainty of a man who never once considered that the woman sitting 6 feet from him might be something far beyond the story he told about her. Edmund didn't look up. His hands rested in his lap now, folded the way mine had been folded throughout the hearing. On him the posture didn't read as discipline. It read as defeat. General Sutton. Judge Pratt's voice shifted, not warmer but different. From judicial authority to something closer to peer-level respect. The court thanks you for your service and apologizes for the extraordinary circumstances that required this disclosure. Your record will remain sealed. This proceeding will be noted in the court file, but the contents of the verification letter will not be entered into public record. I nodded once. Thank you, Your Honor. 4 words. That was all I gave the room. James began packing his briefcase. Major Cole maintained parade rest. The 11 jurors sat in their cracked leather chairs like people watching the final 10 seconds of a film they hadn't expected to end this way. Ray Donovan was staring at his own hands. I stood. I stepped down from the witness box. My shoes were flat, practical. They made almost no sound on the hardwood. I walked past the defense table. Past Richard, who had retrieved his folder from the floor and was now holding it against his chest like a shield. Past the gallery railing. That was when Claire moved. She stood from her seat in the 3rd row. Her cardigan still bunched at the elbows. Her eyes were red. Her mouth opened and I saw the shape of the word before she said it. More. I stopped. I looked at her. 15 years of silence between us. 15 years of Edmund's story settling into her bones. She had sat on his side of the courtroom. She hadn't called when the suit was filed. She had let the distance calcify. But she was my sister. And I could see in the way her hands trembled at her sides that something had cracked inside her in a way she would not be able to tape back together on her own. I didn't know. Her voice was thin, stripped of every bit of classroom steadiness she'd spent years building. I didn't know any of it. He told me. He said you were. I know what he said. Why didn't you tell us? I held her gaze. My voice was level. My hands were still. You didn't ask, Claire. You weren't asking questions. You were accepting answers. She flinched, not physically. Somewhere behind her eyes, a small involuntary retreat. I didn't soften it. I didn't reach for her hand. I didn't offer comfort because comfort would have been its own kind of lie. The kind that makes the giver feel generous and the receiver feel managed. Claire didn't need comfort. She needed the truth to settle. I didn't keep secrets to hurt you. I looked past her at Edmund. He was still in his chair. Richard was whispering to him again. He wasn't listening. I kept them because your opinion was never a matter of national security. Edmund's head rose slowly. The granite jaw tried to reassemble itself. Tried to find the old angle. But the muscles had gone somewhere loose and the geometry was wrong. He looked at me the way a man looks at a road he has driven his entire life when he suddenly realizes it leads somewhere he has never been. I held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then I turned, walked past Major Cole and pushed through the courtroom doors into the marble hallway. The air out there was cooler, cleaner. Tasted like nothing at all. I kept walking. James caught up with me at the elevator. He didn't speak. He pressed the button. We stood side by side in the kind of silence that doesn't need to be filled. 22-6 in sanctions, he said as the doors opened. I heard Richard Vance will be explaining that to Edmund for the next 6 months. Richard Vance will be explaining a great many things for the next 6 months. James almost smiled. Almost. We stepped into the elevator and the doors closed and Harlan County Circuit Court disappeared behind brushed steel. That was the last time I stood in a courtroom for anything connected to my family. 3 weeks later, Richard Vance filed a motion to vacate the sanctions. It was denied. The $22,600 was deducted from Edmund's share of the family trust. The same trust he had tried to weaponize against me. The same trust my mother had assembled with the quiet, deliberate precision of a woman who understood exactly what her husband was capable of when he felt he was losing. The irony was structural. It was load-bearing. And it held. Edmund standing in Harlan County shifted the way coastlines shift. Slowly at first, then suddenly and all at once. The selectman's wife stopped asking his opinion over coffee at the diner on Route 9. The pastor stopped calling. The hardware store quietly began requiring payment at the register. Nobody said anything directly. Nobody needed to. In small towns, the silence of withdrawal is louder than any accusation ever spoken aloud. He tried once to reframe the story. He told someone at the feed supply that the court had made a procedural error and that the government had buried the truth with paperwork. The someone at the feed supply was Ray Donovan's brother-in-law. Ray Donovan had been sitting in the jury box when a major in a Class A uniform saluted his neighbor's daughter and addressed her as General. The story didn't take. Edmund stopped going to the feed supply. Claire called me once, 6 weeks after the hearing. I was in a SCIF at Fort Meade reviewing intercept logs on a blue monitor when my personal phone vibrated in the locker outside the vault. I listened to the voicemail that night in my apartment in Arlington. Her voice was careful, measured. She said she wanted to understand. She said she wasn't asking me to explain anything classified. She said she only wanted to know if there was still a door between us, or if I had sealed it shut. I called her back the next morning. We talked for 11 minutes. I told her what I could. I told her the rest would have to remain what it was. She said she understood. I believed her. Not entirely. Trust, like bone, heals slowly and never quite the same shape as before. But enough. Enough to keep the door cracked open. Not wide, but open. I didn't go to Thanksgiving that year. Not out of bitterness. Not out of pride. But because I no longer needed to step back into a room that had always required me to shrink. 7 months after the hearing, I endowed a scholarship. The Sutton Rural Service Scholarship, for daughters of farming families entering government or public service. Modest fund. Enough to cover 2 years at a state university, renewable once. The ribbon cutting was held at the Harlan County Public Library. Claire attended. She stood in the second row. She didn't make a speech. She didn't need to. Edmund was not invited. It was the only time my name appeared on the exterior of a public building. A small brass plaque beside the main entrance. Established by Mara Sutton. No rank. No branch. No classification level. Just Mara. I work at Fort Meade now. No titles on my office door. No framed commendations on the wall. Just a blue monitor, a matte gray pin, and the kind of silence that doesn't require explaining. There is power in patience. There is a freedom in truth, even when it arrives late, even when it arrives in the middle of a courtroom that smells like floor wax and someone else's certainty. Silence had been the language of my life. For 15 years, my family translated that silence as evidence of failure. They measured my worth by what they could see, found nothing, and filled the empty space with a story that suited them. A story about a woman who left. A woman who lied. A woman who hadn't worked a day since college. They were wrong. I am no longer missing from the narrative. I am simply elsewhere. If you enjoyed this story about quiet competence defeating loud arrogance, hit that like button and let me know what you think in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed yet, make sure to hit subscribe and ring the notification bell for more stories just like this one. Thanks for watching.